Hello, I'm Dean Martin with Transmission Digest. Welcome to the TranStar Industry Studios here at Babcock's Media.
Hello, I'm Mike Riley. Today we're back at TransColonial Auto Service in Chagrin Falls, Ohio. We're not here to wrench on any iron, but to meet with Rick Basta, owner of TransColonial, to get some insight into the operation and how he got here. So let's go in and find him. With me today is Rick Basta, Commander-in-Chief of TransColonial Auto Service. Rick, I want to thank you for sitting down with us to give us a little bit of insight into your operation.
Sure.
I understand that this is not your first shop, that you had a shop prior to this. I'd like to know a little bit about that and how it differs from what you're dealing with today. What was the name of the first shop?
My first shop was Transmission Kings.
Okay.
It was established in 1968 by my father.
Okay.
It evolved from one smaller facility, about 3,500 square foot, moved into a bigger facility, about 6,500 square foot.
And where was the location of that?
Bedford Heights.
Bedford Heights.
Ohio.
And how many lifts did you have initially?
My first shop had about 3 lifts, eventually had to knock it down to 2. The second facility, we had 5 lifts.
And I assume some of those were in ground?
In ground, all removed to above grounds, yes.
How did your employees' size grow over the years as far as how many people you had, whether it was R&R, rebuilding?
Well, we went from a 1 to 2 person R&R shop to a 1 to 2 person rebuilding, including myself, manager, including myself. In the first facility, as we grew through the early 80s, we moved into the larger facility, which we ended up with 2 full-time service advisors, myself. We had 2 full-time R&Rs, and at one time, because we had a remanufactured exchange business, we had 4 rebuilders going.
Wow.
And 2 part-time delivery guys.
Big operation. It
was getting bigger.
When did you actually start in the business with your dad?
73.
73. Okay. The rate of growth over the years, did you notice? I mean, this is back in the 60s, 70s. I know I was around at that time and saw somewhat of a steady growth in business. I would assume you saw the same?
We saw pretty substantial growth through the beginning of the 80s.
The 80s,
you know,
right.
Starting of the front wheel drives.
Right.
The introduction of overdriving. Front wheel was a big asset for us, and it was very good times through the 80s.
When did you actually acquire the business from your dad?
1990, I bought him up.
1990. He had enough.
I guess. He was my silent partner anyway.
From a business standpoint, it's always been a concern as far as like car count. Car counts back then were substantially different than today. Do you have an idea of what your car counts were back then? Yeah, we always track major and minor, and the major car count, of course, was a key. Your car count, I would assume, grew over the years as well?
I would say from our early tracking points was when we started in the second facility. And we kept a pretty good count of tracking of major minors. We always had fairly good majors. The numbers are kind of foggy. It's been over 12 years since I remember that operation. But
it was certainly substantially different than today.
As I was coming through, I belonged to 20 group, and it had quite a few players in it. And I was, you know, for the size shop I had, we were always pretty high on the numbers.
Gotcha. And another factor was ARO, average repair order. I know back then, you know, shops would be probably having a $250, $300 ARO, which is substantially different from today. starting out back in the 60s and 70s, I imagine your ARO was down in that $200, $500 range.
Well, I glanced through some paperwork previously. Our minor AROs were in the $300 range.
Oh, okay.
Our major AROs were at least $750, but that was strictly transmission business.
And that was pretty good at that time.
It was good, yeah.
The type of units also back then, in the 60s you still had some of the oldies, but getting into the 70s, your mixture of business was pretty much the norm, the 350s and Torque 6 and C4, C6. Did you do many import applications?
We started imports as soon as they were out. There was a couple of local Toyota Honda dealers by us, which were the best ones to start with.
Right.
So we did a substantial amount of Honda work.
The overhead, we always tracked the percentage of parts, percentage of direct labor, lights, rent, heat, and I believe that the parts percentage of the operation is substantially different today than it was back then. Right. What you actually had to pay in parts. From a technical standpoint, the model complexities, dealing with the transmissions back then, which we thought at that time were tough, really weren't as bad as what we have to deal with today. Did you find the same?
We kept up on a lot of the original units from the 80s and 90s. You know, we stored an awful lot of cores for hardware. My typical parts cost structure was about 20 to 22% on parts cost for overhead, which was pretty good.
Right.
It's not what it is today.
Even back then, core availability and parts, not soft part, but hard part availability, it was much more plentiful than dealing with the cores today.
Yes.
So if you had to, you could peel down units and get what you had to get.
Yeah, we had a full-time dismantler peeling units all the time.
Even from a tool standpoint, I know there's always been specialty tools, but we would always try to cobble together whatever's necessary. Did you tend to cobble, or did you tend to buy what was needed?
We would create our own tools. We found it was easier. You know, I remember CW with his seminars, and we picked up quite a few tips to make some tools, and still continue with that today.
You could have a lot of money tied up in some of the specialty tools.
One thing I learned from my dad was a tool's worth its weight in gold if it produces.
Something else that I think has changed over the years is the average age of the workforce. Back then it seemed like it was a younger crowd than what it is today. It seems like our business is maturing, and we just don't have the young people that we did back then. Did you find the same?
We would get trainee students out of high school, which if they worked out really well with us, we kept them out as employees.
I assume you did your own training, but did you also have to try to send your employees to whatever schools might be available?
There wasn't a whole lot of schools available back in the 80s.
I know they had GM Training Center, for instance.
And we didn't utilize any of those.
So it's primarily in-house training.
Internal.
And seemed to be successful.
Yeah, everything was pretty much routine before.
The job responsibilities in some of the large production rebuilders, you might have a builder only doing one or two types. Did you try to have your rebuilders rebuild an entire group of transmissions so they didn't know just one or two types?
If we had a builder that was struggling with a certain model, we kept them on an easier model. But I always tried to keep all my guys available to do every trans that was out there that we're working on. Of course, it was only 13, 14 units back.
As opposed to the hundreds.
A couple hundred.
You definitely had much less to contend with back then as opposed to today. Right. So your builders were fairly well rounded.
Yes.
Well, I know that you have some things that you have to address. I want to pick this up a little bit later if you have the time to talk about your operation today and how it differs from then.
Sure.
All right. Well, appreciate it. We'll get back with you in a little bit.
Thank you.